Welcome to The Explainer, where we turn research into understanding. Today, we are tackling a massive question, and we're using some really big data to do it. What does integration actually look like in Western societies? I mean, this has got to be one of the most debated questions of our time, right? It's filled with deeply held beliefs, personal stories, and, let's be honest, a whole lot of political noise.
So today, we're going to try to cut through all that noise. We're setting aside the assumptions and diving straight into the data. We're looking at these big cross-national surveys from Europe and the US to see what they really tell us about this incredibly complex and often surprising process of integration.
Okay, so where do we even begin with something this big? Well, let's start with something that's basically the glue that holds a society together: trust. You know, there's this common idea, this theory, about how integration and trust are supposed to work. The thinking goes like this. Immigrants from places with lower social trust move to the West, and over time, they, and especially their kids, will start to adopt the higher trust levels of their new home. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And yeah, at first glance, the data seems to back this up. So, on a scale of 0 to 10, what the research calls rooted Europeans, that's folks with at least one parent born in the country, they have an average trust level of about 5.5. First-generation immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa, you'll see it called MENA, they start out a little bit lower. So far, so good. This all fits the theory perfectly. So, here's the million-dollar question. Does the next generation close that gap? You'd think their kids, who grew up entirely in this new society, would naturally become more trustful. That's the logical next step, isn't it? Well, this is where things get really interesting, because the data takes a sharp, unexpected turn. For several key groups, the exact opposite happens. What you're seeing here is the trust deficit compared to native Europeans. And you can see the first generation starts out with a small gap, but look at the second generation. That gap actually gets wider. Just look at that number. For second-generation immigrants with Middle Eastern Muslim backgrounds, that trust gap widens to negative 0.74 points. And for Eastern European Muslims, it more than doubles. So instead of trust levels going up, they're actually going down. It's a total reversal of what we'd expect. The research really suggests this could be a story of alienation, a sign that the experience for the second generation is maybe way more challenging than we give it credit for. Okay, let's shift gears. The next piece of our integration puzzle is happiness and life satisfaction. And what's fascinating here is that the picture looks completely different from what we just saw with trust. This is another one of those moments where the data really throws you a curveball. You'd think with all the different journeys and challenges, there'd be a huge gap in life satisfaction. But the overall difference between immigrants and natives is tiny, just 0.2 points on a 10-point scale. It's remarkably small. But, averages can hide a lot. Once you start digging into the details, you see that for certain first-generation groups like Muslim South Asians and Middle Easterners, that gap is a bit bigger. And then for the second generation, a really noticeable happiness gap does pop up, especially for people of Caribbean descent. And this really hints at how big a role economic factors can play. Take Germany, for example. Turkish immigrants there, who tend to face higher unemployment rates, report lower life satisfaction in both the first and second generations when you compare them to other Christian immigrant groups. It's just a powerful reminder that, at the end of the day, a sense of well-being is so deeply tied to economic opportunity. All right, now we're moving on to probably the most sensitive and frankly the most misunderstood part of this whole discussion: attitudes toward political violence. And this is an area where the headlines we see every day often just don't line up with the data. So let's start in Europe. What the data shows is pretty clear. There's an overwhelming consensus against terrorism. A whopping 92% of native-born Europeans say that terrorism must always be condemned, no matter the reason. And immigrant groups, they largely agree. First-generation immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa show a similarly high rate, with 85% condemning it unconditionally. Now, over in the United States, the data flat-out challenges a really common stereotype. The research actually shows that immigrant Muslims are significantly more likely than the general American public to say that violence against civilians is never justified. Let that sink in. We're talking 82% of first-generation Muslims holding that view, compared to just 59% of the general population. It's a pretty stunning difference. Now, at the same time, it's really important to look at the whole picture, because it is complex. The research does show that a sizable minority in some communities will express sympathy for violence, but only in very specific contexts. For example, a 2018 poll in Britain found that while the vast majority condemn it, 24% of Muslims did express some sympathy for violence when it was in defense of their religion. So yeah, the data is definitely not simple.
Okay, so after wading through all this data on trust and happiness and these really sensitive attitudes on violence, what's the takeaway? What does this integration equation actually tell us?
Well, for one thing, the data paints a mosaic, not a monolith. It's crystal clear that integration is not some simple, straight-line path. We've seen that the children of immigrants can, paradoxically, become less trustful, not more. We've seen that happiness levels are surprisingly pretty similar across the board. And we've seen that the data on attitudes toward violence just completely defies the simple stories we get from the headlines.
So, what this all does is it forces us to throw out those simple narratives of success or failure. The data is demanding a much more honest, a much more nuanced conversation. And that leaves us with one last really critical question to think about. If the data shows our basic assumptions are wrong, what are the new questions we should be asking to build a genuinely shared future?